on the assumption that they were not going to find any enemies. In other words, they came in ready to pick up Ukraine. And they didn't have enough fuel, the troops weren't trained, and that was the first mistake. They thought it was 1944, and it's Heinz Guderian, the German general who was attacking, and they've never recovered from that mistake. It had to, but what it really is guerrilla warfare without a jungle or a forest or something. So this is sort of how the Viet Cong operated. This is certainly how the Taliban operated. But in their case, they had terrain that wasn't flat, that wasn't open. What's extraordinary about the Ukrainians is they're using guerrilla tactics on terrain they should be wiped out. But they have one huge advantage of the guerrilla. There is no central command that if you destroy it, they lose the war. There's no way to break up their communications because they're not communicating. One thing we also have to remember is unique here. The weapons that the Americans are providing them to fight with are built for this kind of autonomous battle. The Javelin anti-tank missile, which is extremely effective, is built to be carried by 1-2-man troop. Now we've had another surge of weapons in. So the advantage of the Ukrainians is both the fact that they are dispersed and that they're receiving weapons of extraordinary quality. World War II was a war of cities. The Russians advanced on Berlin. Kiev and other places were seized by the Germans. In their mindset, the prize is the city. That's the source of supplies. That's the support of direction. And the Russian doctrine that go after the city is helping the Ukrainians, tragically killing civilians. But they're capturing it, and it gives them no advantage in the field because that's not where supplies and communications flow from. Well, if you're going to have an armored war, your tanks have to be survivable, and they're not anymore. If you're going to have an air war, your planes mustn't be shot down. The anti-air systems that have been transferred to them will shoot them down. It's very good. Yeah, I didn't think they would last. I misread the Russian army. I thought the Russian army was more significant, more capable than it was. It took me several days to realize that it's not. And what I have to give credit to the U.S. is the rapid turnaround and the rapid sending of weapons. But we also have to remember that the Germans were sending weapons and the British were sending weapons before we were. It's a big country, a big population in Russia, and there's maybe time. The problem is this. The Russians never had first-class troops. They had brave troops, but not really superbly trained. It was the officers that moved them around and stuff. Well, now they don't have the very best officers either. As the beginning of the war showed, the generals didn't understand what they were doing. So they've got a problem in the officer corps that they can't quickly fix. And simply feeding more untrained infantrymen into the situation isn't going to help. The Ukrainians are highly motivated. The Russians want to go home. Well, they're going to have to, and I'm not sure what the Russians are capable of in terms of flexibility. They've shown very little flexibility in this. If they get knocked out of one theater, they go after another city for various reasons that I can understand. But they are in Poland. They are flowing. The training is going on, and they're going to make a huge difference on the battlefield. But what I don't know is, do the Russians have another 500,000 troops tucked away somewhere, able to come in as a second wave? Was their strategy to hit them with the first wave, destabilize the Ukrainians to what extent they could, and then come in with a second wave? There's no evidence that there is this second wave, but without that second wave, I don't know how the Russians win. Only if they have these reserves or a massive call-up, a draft, which they haven't done, and get them trained. You can't fight a war of attrition, only taking attrition. You have to have replacements. Well, particularly the Moskva, which was one of their pearls, going down hit them. But no, they didn't seem to understand that the U.S. was going to feed intelligence. And kind of for psychological warfare reasons, they were revealed that they were feeding intelligence. Because now every Russian soldier is wondering if the CIA is mapping them. So there are so many reasons why the Russians should give up, but there were so many reasons before Stalingrad that they should give up. Yes. Russians, right?
Well, if we lost Texas and we lost Washington State and maybe Florida, then we could understand what we're looking at, especially if you lost Texas. So he created 3 buffers, but the key buffer wasn't there. Ukraine, with M3, the road, straight up. And he had to have that. And he demanded one thing, which is symbolic, that Ukraine never be allowed to be in NATO. Now, Ukraine had never been in NATO. NATO never wanted Ukraine. But Putin doesn't think that way. Putin says, what will happen tomorrow? Okay? And he wanted that. And he felt that the only reason the Americans refused him was they intended it as a jumping off point. Why not give us what we need? The Americans said, because it's a sovereign country, we can't touch them. Sovereign schmavrin. You stole the whole of North America from the Indians. That was okay. He didn't say that. He probably didn't know it, but it was the same way he looked at it. The Americans would say, because it's a sovereign country, and he would think of all the sovereign countries, like Serbia, which we bombed. He decided that he had no choice but to attack. Now, the war itself is interesting because it was the only war when both the Americans and the Russians agreed on what would happen. The Ukrainians would collapse. There was the chairman of Joint Chiefs gave them 72 hours. Putin gave them 5 days. He was generous. But Putin deployed his forces in an irrational way. And this is where the story becomes more difficult. He created 3 armored groups. One located just west of Voronezh, east of Voronezh. One in Belarus. That one was coming down to Kiev. The one in the east was going to the eastern frontier, and one in Crimea. It looked like Heinz Guderian had been resurrected from the grave. This was a World War II structure and the typical problem of the Russian army. They've never gotten over Marshal Zhukov. If Marshal Zhukov attacked with tanks, we have to have tanks. During the Cold War, when I had some responsibility in trying to find out what the Russians were doing, it was an amazing thing. They were going to run on armor alone, leaving infantry behind. Now here's a secret. Tanks use gasoline or petroleum. And they never figured out how to keep up the gasoline trucks with the tanks. Or better yet, how not to get the gasoline trucks blown up with the tanks. They had all sorts of solutions, such as plastic pipes running, okay? And the problem with plastic pipes is they leaked. So you figured they would fix it. So you go back next year and watch the same exercise, same leaking pipe. The same sort of action was taken in Iraq, in Ukraine, which is first he had 3 armored groups, uncoordinated with infantry, almost impossible to manage at 200 miles apart, with 3 different loads of logistics required to run the tanks. And so he's attacking on 3 fronts in a country he thought would collapse. The result was, if you remember, the 40-kilometer line of tanks lined up. This was done, I believe, with 2 Javelin missiles knocking out the first 2 tanks, 2 Javelin missiles knocking out the last 2 tanks, and God took care of the mud on the right. One train was blocked. Another was not going very far. They were engaging along the frontier. And a final force that was supposed to go to Kiev couldn't get close to it. The psychological effect on the Ukrainians was enormous. what they also thought they would lose. They had thought that the Russians had a magnificent military force and knew how to operate. None of them, except for your grandfathers there, had ever fought in the Russian army and knew better. The transformation that took place in the Ukraine on realizing that the Russians really were unable to mount an effective offensive transformed the war. Suddenly the Ukrainians saw there was a purpose to fight. And the Russians had no real solution because they had not bought infantry. They wanted an armored war. They didn't bring in infantry until later, and the infantry said basically, where am I? Why am I here? The infantry was completely unprepared and then threw them into house-to-house fighting. Now, house-to-house fighting is ugly. But when you're attacking somebody's house who lives in it, and he knows where the bathroom is, I mean, this is really putting you at a disadvantage. Every possible way to ambush you, every possible rooftop that you could be taken from, was knocking out massive casualties, numbers we couldn't believe at the time.